An estimated 12 million Africans were forcibly shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World, taken from their homes, and were shipped off to be sold to those who exploited them. This is the story of one ship who rather die fighting for their freedom than accept a cruel fate. This is the Armstead Revolt of 1839.
Before arriving at the slave pens in Havana, Cuba, also known as barracoons, the 49 adults, 4 children that were part of the Amistad Revolt, came on the Portuguese ship named Tacora, on what was about a 2-month voyage from the present-day Sierra Leone. The Tacora was a notorious slave trade ship of the brig kind. It had speed that enabled it to outrun British Royal Navy vessels patrolling the area. The shipping of slaves had been deemed illegal as of the Slave Trade Act of 1807 by the Parliament of the United Kingdom. The act prohibited slave trade throughout the British Empire. The Tacora had the capacity to transport about 500 slaves within its hull. It set sail in the month of April 1839 to the Americas from Fort Lomboko, which is on the Gillian coast of Sierra Leone at the mouth of the Galenas River. This area was a British colony at that time, and as a major trading post, Fort Lomboko included barracoons which could house around 5,000 slaves at one time. Slaves were kept naked and shackled in confinement during the long passage. This would be a formula for disease due to the poor hygiene and tight quarters that they had to endure. Disease, torture, and malnourishment contributed to the deaths of several slaves. The disease would be thrown overboard, and those who survived were placed in the slave trade market upon their arrival at their destination. Havana, being a Spanish colony, was still able to conduct slave trade at this time. The slaves were acquired from the surrounding regions of Fort Lomboko. Even though with the illegality of the Atlantic slave trade, it was estimated that by 1839, the fortress that was run by Spanish slave merchants was exporting 2,000 slaves a year. All had been expropriated from their land and enslaved by various means, whether it be judicial ruling, kidnapping, or military actions around the Mende land from at least 10 different ethnicities and nationalities that included Mende, Temi, and Kono people. They shared an unusual large capacity for communication among themselves. Almost 2/3 were Mende, and several others could speak the Mende language too. Upon landing in Havana, they were housed in barracoons for 10 days before plantation owners, Don Jose Ruiz and Don Pedro Montes, purchased 53 African slaves. They planned to take them around the island and sell them into domestic slave trade. On the 28th of June, they would set sail to Puerto Príncipe on the ship named Amistad that was captained by Ramon Ferrer.
The historical account of the slave revolt on La Amistad usually centers around the African slave point of view. Only until recently have there been discoveries made on the lives and viewpoints from the Spanish on board the ship. Captain Ramon Ferrer and the ship's cook Celestino were the 2 Spaniards that were killed as a result of the revolt. Captain Ramon Ferrer was one of the many Catalans that emigrated from Ibiza, Spain to Cuba during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. By 1830, Ferrer and his brother had become involved in the trading business between Havana and the ports of Guanaja and Puerto Príncipe. At first glance, the Ferrer brothers were modest sailors and traders of goods that entered the ports of Cuba. Documents prepared by chief custom authorities in Guanaja from December 1836 listed the officially declared cargo on board one of Ferrer's ships with basic goods such as fabric, boxes of cigarettes, sacks of coffee, and other trivial goods. What was kept off the record, however, from official documents was the mention of the illegal African slaves that he transported on his ships, which was his main priority when it came to his business ventures. On June 27, 1839, a licencia, or as how subsequent court papers would refer to as a passport, was obtained by Pedro Martinez, which authorized the passage by sea to Puerto Príncipe of 49 Negro Ladinos owned by Don Jose Ruiz. The names of the children were omitted from the report but are still accounted for in the actual case. What is important to note is that according to the passport that was granted to the Amistad, the captives on the ship were labeled as Negro Ladinos, meaning that they were born in Cuba or that they were coming from other territories of the Spanish Empire. Corruption in the forms of bribery and the falsification of official documents were used in order to maintain the illegal importation of slaves from Africa, not just in the case of La Amistad, but all over the Caribbean as well. Once La Amistad was on its voyage, tensions began rising between the Spanish traders and the captives. Hostility was building as a result from the harsh treatment by the traders. Captain Ferrer and his crew members would use whips, clubs, and fists to beat and control the slaves. The physical abuse already infuriated the captives. But one of the main forms of mistreatment by the traders came in the form of starving the slaves. By the third night on board, Ferrer ordered that the rations for the slaves to be cut in half. 2 potatoes and 1 plantain twice a day was the nourishment that the slaves received. Water also played a big factor in the lead up to the revolt. Half a teacup of water in the morning and half a teacup in the evening was what the slaves received. The cook Celestino and other crew members were taught the dehydration of the captives by washing their clothes with fresh water and taking baths near where the slaves were being held. One night, some of the captives were able to free themselves and find a water supply below the deck. They were caught, and Captain Ferrer ordered at least 5 of the men to be restrained and flogged. In order to maximize the torture, a mixture of rum, salt, and gunpowder were applied to the burning wounds on the backs of the slaves. With tensions on the ship reaching a new high after days of torture, it was only a matter of time before the resistance from the slaves would become physical and violent.
The Africans had reached a tipping point when the threats of the cook would begin to worry them, fearful that the cook, Celestino, would be true to his words. These torments and threats would begin to work on the Africans, as they would start to believe Celestino and would fear that he genuinely would kill and eat them. Among the Africans was a rice farmer known as Singbe Pie, or Joseph Sinke, as he would become popular in the United States, who had been from the Mende ethnic group of Sierra Leone. It would be up to Sinke to put an end to their worries, as he would begin to rally the rest of the Africans to defend themselves. In order to inspire the other Africans to fight, Sinke had stated, "We may as well die trying to be free as to be eaten and killed." The voyage to Puerto Príncipe from Havana had meant only to be 3 days. However, the weather caused a delay, and it was on that third night of travel that Sinke would begin the revolt. Allegedly, Sinke had hidden away either a loose nail or file that he would use to begin breaking out the Africans from their iron padlocks and chains from their necks. Sinke and roughly 40 other men would swiftly begin to arm themselves with cane knives found on the ship. Celestino, the cook that had tormented the Africans with threats of eating them, would be killed in the skirmish between the Spanish and Africans. Captain Ramon Frier would meet the same fate, and 2 more seamen would jump overboard to escape in a small boat. The Africans, with Sinke as their leader, had managed to overthrow the Amistad with only 2 casualties from their side. However, herein lies their next obstacle, managing to steer themselves to safety. The Africans had no sailing experience whatsoever, so they had to rely on José Ruiz and Pedro Montes, the 2 plantation owners who had bought the Africans. Sinke had kept them alive with the demand that Ruiz and Montes help navigate the ship to take them back to Africa. He had demanded that the 2 men navigate them toward the east with the rising sun. As such, during the day, the Amistad was steered toward the east, back to Africa. However, Montes would be quick to trick them. At night, while the Africans slept, Montes would change the course. He would use the stars as navigation, heading north and west, with the destination being the Americas. This constant change of directions would delay the voyage a further 2 months, and during that time, everyone on board began to suffer from a lack of water and food. Subsequently, Africans would begin to die because of these conditions, and desperation for help grew. In the end, the Africans and Sinke began to realize that Ruiz and Montes had deceived them. However, their need to survive above all had them anchored near Long Island so that Sinke could gather supplies. However, here they would be discovered by the U.S. Navy. Lieutenant Gedney would capture the Amistad and have the Africans arrested. Ultimately, the Africans would face further adversity as they would be taken to New London, Connecticut, a slave state, and would face trial for the next 18 months.
After being captured by naval officers Gedney and Meade in 1839, the Africans were faced with yet another fight for their freedom, this one in the legal arena. The most important thing to understand about this case is that it was highly politicized. American abolitionists pushed for the Africans' freedom to make a point about the evils of slavery, while pro-slavery parties such as President Martin Van Buren tried everything in their power to keep these slaves from going free because they knew in the long term it was going to set a new precedence to the subject of slavery. Many contemporary newspapers relay the common theme of not understanding why the American legal system had anything to do with this case at all. Some seem to think that this was a Spanish dispute and the Africans should be held accountable by the Spanish legal system. However, abolitionists knew that sending them back to Spain would be a death sentence. First, the Africans were indicted on the charges of piracy and murder. At this early stage, it seemed like they would simply be sent back to Spain to be dealt with there. However, Gedney and Meade demanded their portion of salvage and sued for compensation. Next, Henry Green and Pelatiah Fordham also were attempting to claim salvage because they had helped by capturing the Africans who had come ashore for supplies. Next, a U.S. government attorney made a claim on behalf of the Spanish government that the Africans were protected as cargo under a U.S.-Spanish treaty and should be given back to their Spanish owners and sent home immediately. Even faced with this barrage of opposition, the Africans got their day in court. American abolitionists worked hard to get these Africans a translator. Thanks to this effort, the Africans were able to argue their side of the case, that they were African-born, stolen from their country, and illegally traded according to both Spanish and American law. This was enough for the judge, and on January 7, 1840, the judge declared the Africans unlawfully imported and free men that were to be sent back to Africa. Gedney and Meade were awarded salvage rights to the cargo, but not to the Africans, as they had no monetary value in Connecticut. Greed and Fordham were denied any salvage rights as they had never boarded the ship. Unfortunately, the battle was not over. The U.S. government attorney appealed the court's decision, sending the case on to the next highest court, the Circuit Court. After the Circuit Court quickly reaffirmed the previous ruling, this case went on to the highest court, the Supreme Court. The abolitionists knew that they needed the most talented lawyer for this case, so they hired John Quincy Adams, former U.S. President. Adams gave a passionate defense. He gained the African sympathy by claiming they were victims of executive tyranny. He accuses the American legal system of using this case as a means to an end and claimed they were not delivering unprejudiced justice. Adams implied that this kind of treatment, once started, would not end with Africans. On March 9, 1841, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Africans, setting them free. However, the Supreme Court denied that it was the United States' responsibility to send them home. They still had one more step to their journey home.
In its decision, the Supreme Court cleared U.S. government of any reparational duties, and new President John Tyler declined to provide funds to its own accord. Salvage rights went to the naval officers, not the Africans. As a result, abolitionists were forced to raise money from scratch for their journey back to Sierra Leone. When Africans subsequently drowned from a possible suicide, the number of survivors fell to 35. At last, November 26, 1841, they and 5 Christian missionaries boarded a boat, arriving to their destination about 7 weeks later. A few of the Amistad rebels stayed with the missionaries, including 4 children who all took English names, but most apparently made a beeline to the families and vanished from the historical records. This was the story of the Amistad Revolt.